Welcome back to IMF World Bank Week Spring Meetings Edition with the Atlantic Council. We are live inside IMF HQ2. I'm Nicole Goldin, Head of Equitable Development at UNU Center for Policy Research and non-resident Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council. One of the big issues here this week is domestic resource mobilization for a variety of reasons that we are going to unpack, but suffice to say, we know that countries have limited fiscal space, and at the same time, there are, choose your number, but in the trillions in terms of the investment gap to reach the Sustainable Development Goals, to achieve climate resilience, and to really, for countries to invest in their growth and development. So there's a new sense of urgency, I think, around domestic resource mobilization. Lucky for me, today I am so pleased to be joined here in the studio by Ceyla Pazarbasioglu. She's the Director of Strategy, Policy, and Review Department of the IMF, and otherwise known as SPR to those in the know, and also by Pablo Saavedra, Vice President of the Prosperity Vertical at the World Bank. It's a bit of a mouthful, so I hope I got everyone's names and titles right. And we have limited time, so I'm going to get right into it with you. Let me ask each of you your perspective. Pablo, we'll start with you on what do you think's behind this, as I call it, DRM imperative?
Sure. When we started this joint initiative with the IMF last year, we're looking at the numbers. And when you look at that, you see that among low-income countries and lower middle-income countries, there are 75% of those countries that collect less than 15% of GDP. 15% of GDP is basically a threshold under which it's very difficult to provide a good basket of services and infrastructure to the population. So that started the whole thing. Now, when you look at today, and we have added uncertainty, maybe some additional debt vulnerabilities building up, the DRM agenda becomes even more urgent.
Ceyla, same?
So same. I mean, it's very important for countries, but also to build trust within countries, right? To the three key areas that this joint initiative looks at is the first one is revenues, public sector revenues. Pablo talked about it, mainly tax revenues, but more broadly. Second part is spending, how they are spending, is it efficient, and so on. And that's where trust is very critical, right? Citizens want to see that the money goes into the right place. And then the third bucket is building public debt markets, which are critical to mobilize domestic savings. So on all these three pillars, it's very important for countries to have ownership of the reforms, but also use it as a way to signal to citizens that they are there for them. So it's to do all the development needed spending and do it in a wise way is the key motto that we have now.
And this environment is being compounded, if you will, the challenge by declining official development assistance and all the other things that Pablo mentioned. What do you see as the kind of key challenges in building that trust from the kind of purview of the IMF and in your work in the fiscal space?
Yeah. So the key challenge is for the countries to own this, for the governments to own this and actually come up with the types of reforms that are needed. And the nice thing about this initiative, I mean, we have been working on DRM issues for decades, the bank and the fund. But the nice thing is now we are working much more jointly together. So it's joint diagnostics, agreeing together with the authorities, what are the key reform areas, how can we come up with a reform matrix, what do they need to do, and how we can support them jointly. So having joint visits to countries, providing technical assistance jointly, I think it's really great to leverage our own efficiencies and also expertise. So that I think will help very much.
No, that's a great point. And just picking up on that, Pablo, what are you seeing is, from your perspective, from the bank side, some of the key challenges that the countries that you're supporting through the initiative are facing in terms of generating more revenues and more resources? And then also, from the joint initiative side, where have you seen kind of some of the big progress?
So on the challenges, and maybe let's stick to the point on revenues. Think about a country where in most of the cases that we're dealing with, they have very low levels of revenue. And because they have very low levels of revenue, they can provide very modest services with a number of shortcomings. And then the population, in turn, don't have the value of the public sector in services that they expect. And then in turn, they don't want to continue or have their taxes raised. That generates a political economy problem that typically hampers this type of reform. So one has to break this sort of vicious circle that you have between low revenues, no services, again, nobody willing to pay taxes. So one way to do it is the way that Paraguay did it, for example, by putting in place tax administration measures that with the same policy started to generate more revenues. Another way is to start and push the envelope with expenditure efficiency to show some value to the population and gain some of the trust that Ceyla was talking about, to break that vicious circle and turn it into a more virtuous cycle that people can start getting to pay taxes and you can get the agenda moving. I think that's the biggest challenge. Of course, there's a communication strategy that also needs to come in terms of tax reform. So I think the strategy and implementing that, passing through the legislation, that has a number of challenges that we need to think about.
So it's also, if I can add to that,
please.
there are two other challenges. One is informality. For many of the countries, they have a large informal sector, agriculture sector, and that becomes more difficult. They are not part of the system. And here, digitalization provides opportunities because it will not only make the systems more efficient, but also allow more to be able to participate in the economy. So I think that's a very good way of both bringing the informal sector to contribute to this, but also be more accountable in terms of efficiency of spending and where the money goes and so on. So I think digital has a very important potential contribution to this. And then the other is, of course, vested interest. So when you have a large informal sector and only a small base, the small base ends up paying the taxes, and that small base all of a sudden becomes much more politically powerful. So in this current environment where there is a lot of uncertainty, policy uncertainty, we talked about it during the spring meetings here, I think countries, what I have been very encouraged by is every country is saying, okay, what do I need to do to make myself more resilient, more, be able to increase growth, investment, and so on? What are the reforms that I need to implement? And I think that's why this is very timely, I think, this initiative.
Absolutely. And picking up on the informality piece and the economic participation piece, increasing the workforce and the sort of tax base is obviously another route to increasing domestic resources. And on that, we know that the theme of these spring meetings is jobs. So Pablo, how do you see that connection between the jobs agenda and DRM?
Yes, so in the bank we have this strategy to tackle the challenge of jobs. And the first part of that strategy is the foundational infrastructure, meaning energy, water, having people, education, health, all the basic fundamentals to enable a workforce and to enable a business environment. The second block is the regulatory aspects, and the third block is basically all how to bring the private sector money. So for the first block, the foundational infrastructure, revenues are critical. If there's no fiscal space, with limited fiscal space, it's very hard to, countries are already in high levels of debt. So the only way is to revenue mobilization that enables the fiscal space so infrastructure could be generated. Those jobs in infrastructure, even in the construction, in the operation, generate jobs. And then you have infrastructure for the private sector to operate and to hire more people. So it has it's a very clear link between the revenue side and what can we do with jobs.
And I'm glad you kind of reinforced the debt piece, because as you said, the jobs and the agenda are very linked, but so is the debt. As we're saying, that's kind of part of this imperative. We know at least kind of half of the countries in the low-income countries are in or at high risk of debt distress. More money is being paid out in interest and debt service payments than is necessarily coming in. So debt is an issue I know Ceyla, the IMF, has been tackling, and the Global Sovereign Debt Roundtable just met. So kind of in the solutions and the, adding on different from the initiative, how does sort of the debt piece come in, GSDR? What are some of the new outcomes
Yep.
of the meeting there that are kind of worth
Very good.
noting here?
Very good, and that's another joint initiative. As you know, the Global Sovereign Debt Roundtable is co-chaired by the IMF Managing Director, the World Bank President, and this year it's South Africa, the G20 presidency. And it's just a quick, if I step back, it's basically the first time a platform that brings debtor countries, creditors, both Paris Club and non-Paris Club, so the new creditors, as well as the private sector together. So it's a very good forum to discuss what have been the impediments to debt restructurings. It's another forum to do individual debt restructurings, right? That has their own place, but this is where things get bottlenecks and how we can collectively reach an understanding so that things can move faster. And this GSDR was excellent in that context. We were able to publish a debt restructuring playbook, which was published yesterday. It basically provides the steps that the country needs to take and also tips in terms of how to make the process more timely, quicker, and so on. So it's a very good document. It's a short document, but it's a living document. As we make more progress, as we learn from new cases, this is so that countries can see if they are thinking about debt restructuring, what is it that they need to do, in what sequence, what are the different stakeholders, and how they can engage better to get a good outcome for themselves. So I think that was a very important contribution of the initiative. We also talked, of course, about what you just said, that vulnerabilities, increasing debt servicing costs, and how we can help countries. Seems like we're working very hard together because we have another initiative, the three-pillar approach. Maybe you can talk about it, which links nicely to this DRM as well.
Yes, absolutely. I actually had a conversation in this studio on Tuesday with William Roos, co-chair of the Paris Club, and we were at that point anticipating the playbook. So I'm glad to see that it's out. I look forward to reviewing it personally. And one of the issues we talked about in that conversation was some of the challenges on the demand side for engaging in some of these restructuring processes. But let's hear more about the three-pillar approach.
So the three-pillar approach, again, a joint initiative between the bank and the fund, is...
I love having all these synergy conversations.
It's basically, it has three pillars. The first one is about reforms. It's about growth, it's about jobs, it's about DRM, it's about all the structural reforms you need to have in place to grow and to afford that process. The second pillar is about how we all come together, providing net positive flows to countries that are under a liquidity pressure, which is all about, the three-pillar approach is about dealing with countries that have sustainable debt, they have good macro frameworks, but they are suffering or going through a temporary liquidity pressure. So it's about positive flows, the second pillar. And the third pillar is about liability management operations, debt for development swaps, debt buybacks, other transactions that can help countries generate some liquidity, go through the hump of liquidity pressures and move forward.
So really key points, and I'm loving hearing how you're working together. Do you see further opportunities for the IMF and the World Bank, not only to continue working together, but in the broader kind of international financial architecture with other MDBs, with other IFIs, through or within the scope of the fourth financing for development agenda leading up to Sevilla this summer? How do you see the sort of expanded international financial architecture and potential opportunities? Ceyla, why don't we start with you on that one?
So, I mean, we have been working very closely with the bank, but also with other multilateral and regional development banks because the needs are huge. And each institution brings their own experience and expertise. We work very closely with, of course, we're sister institutions, so we have been working very closely for many years on really looking at the fund, really looking at what are the ways to support countries if they are having balance of payment difficulties, how we can support them. We provide financial assistance, but then in terms of the structural reforms, which is really critical for sustained and inclusive growth, we really partner with the World Bank or in different regions with other MDBs as well, because those are long-term structural policies that these institutions have much more experience and expertise on. And I think going forward, we need to do even more.
I mean, Pablo, there was the big memorandum of understanding that was signed last year between the World Bank and the other regional banks. How are you seeing this potentially play out in support of DRM specifically?
Well, DRM is as Ceyla was saying, a very big agenda. I think it's to be tackled in the majority of countries. Yeah. And I think there is plenty of space for everyone to work on. And in fact, in many countries, there is a lot of interventions of the regional development banks. We often work and partner with bilateral donors, agencies of countries that have experts, that lend their experts in the programs that we support. And of course, we partner with the OECD. We partner with a large number of stakeholders. And in the context of the Financing for Development agenda, I think DRM should be front and center. This is an agenda where I think everybody agrees needs to be tackled, and when we require the efforts of everybody. So I think moving forward that with much more impulse and strength, this agenda is going to be critical there.
I mean, absolutely. Sorry, Jill. I was just saying. I mean, we've already seen it. A lot of language around it, and definitely one of the key priorities in the first draft, I think, is the current one we have. So
there's usually we talk about, when you think about the fund, the first thing that comes to mind is fiscal, tax, and so on. But I think in this initiative, there's a very important part of also increasing spending efficiency, but also developing local bond markets, government bond markets. And I think that's really critical to mobilize domestic savings, which is very important. If you have a well-functioning government bond market, then that helps also with corporate bond market and equity markets and so on, which you really need the private sector to come in and support growth. So I think this part should also get a lot of emphasis. And there is a lot of potential effort from different MDBs and different partners in making sure that, reducing foreign exchange risk, better managing foreign exchange risk, and developing the longer term maturity and more transparent debt markets in countries.
It's a really important, picking up on that. Yeah.
Maybe to add on that, because a very important point. Domestic capital markets remain still an untapped source of resources. And I think countries are still leaving some money on the table by not tapping them. It's more complicated. It doesn't fit all country settings, but I think there's a concerted effort as part of our joint work to do that too. And in this context, think about the opportunities for investments, for jobs, etc. Many countries, particularly developing countries, the financial sector is heavily bank dependent. So opening up other sources of financing in the capital markets, debt markets, local, it's a great opportunity.
I mean, picking up on that and picking up on, Ceyla brought up the digital piece earlier. I know the World Bank is, doing a lot of work around sort of digital, not only just digital public infrastructure, but digital financial infrastructure. How do you see sort of that kind of, whether it's on the payment side, on remittance side, just the idea of sort of fintechs and digital finance to help smooth some of this, and as you said, provide an alternative for some of the maybe weaker traditional banking systems?
Sure, the digital side brings us sort of opportunities. One, on the digital infrastructure, the possibility to connect people to jobs, but also on the financial side, the cross-border payments, fast payment systems within countries. It enables a number of economic opportunities for people, particularly for women and young people that maybe were not in reach before. And for the government, we were talking a lot about domestic revenue mobilization, as we were saying earlier. The digitalization of tax administrations, which is happening, it provides a great opportunity also to be much more efficient. So the opportunities are across the board and are significant.
And it can come into play on the combating illicit finance side, and as you said, sort of helping prevent some of the leakage and some of the other things that we see on the tax side. Jill, you were about to weigh in.
No, I was
okay.
just going to say it's a very important, I mean, and you've seen this in India, in Brazil, in many other countries now, some African countries like Kenya with M-Pesa and so on. It does help bring in the, SMEs, actually micro enterprises, people who never had an opportunity to get any credit through this digital financial infrastructure. They can be included, and that, of course, not only helps with well-being, growth, and so on, but also developing the financial, the credit culture and the financial architecture in the country.
And it goes back to the formalization and moving folks out of informality and into that. So we're almost up on time, which is hard to believe because it's been a fascinating, if not fast and brief conversation. What are you most hopeful about, and what are you most worried about going forward on domestic resource mobilization? Who wants to start on that one?
Domestic revenue mobilization?
Yeah.
I mean, I'm very hopeful that there are many opportunities to be tapped on. And these days, it's not so much about raising rates. It's about broadening the tax base. And there are plenty of opportunities to broaden the tax base. In average, developing countries have around 3% of GDP in tax expenditures, tax exemptions. So there's a huge source that can be tapped from there. The tax administration, digitalization angle that we were just discussing provides, again, a massive angle to broaden the base, bring in also untapped sources of revenue. So I think I'm very hopeful that can be done. I think
you mentioned Paraguay earlier. Any other examples out there that
Pakistan
you're looking
is a great
Pakistan?
example.
Yeah.
Pakistan, they just did a significant reform with some of the angles that we discussed, very successful. We were discussing that with the Minister of Pakistan recently in an event, with the Minister of Paraguay as well. I think these are great examples, both of them.
Their credit rating was...
and I think the concern always is about doing these things carefully, with good design, building trust. This is critical. I think if the population doesn't have that trust with the government through some demonstration effect, it's more difficult. And I think the challenge is always that because there was no good design or there was communication, it's another piece that always worries me. We spend too little time on communication, planning the communication process and engaging all the stakeholders. And I think that those are always the challenges that one has to deal with.
Ceyla, what are you optimistic and what worries you?
Well, I'm optimistic because I've always seen that in turbulent times, it provides an opportunity to actually go against the vested interests and do the reforms that are very difficult to implement. So on that sense, I'm optimistic. I'm worried that some countries may miss this opportunity. So hopefully more countries will use it, and those that actually use it will benefit a lot because there will be differentiation. Official development assistance is declining, concessional finance is declining. Many advanced economies have their own needs in terms of climate transition, in terms of defense expenditures, and so on. So finance is becoming much more difficult to attract, and countries that do the reforms will be much better able to attract domestic as well as international FDI, portfolio flows, and so on. So I think it's an incredible opportunity, and I do hope that countries benefit from it.
I'm glad you ended up bringing it back to an opportunity because I feel like I should have asked those in reverse. And I'm encouraged by just hearing about the level of engagement, the level of coordination and cooperation. I think it is an all hands on deck need and imperative for all the reasons we've talked about. So thank you so much for joining me to unpack it even just a little bit. And I look forward to following both of your work and the progress going forward. Please stay with us here in the Atlantic Council studios. Join us back at 4:15 when my colleague Charles Litchfield will be joined by Sebastian Danloy. He is the Chief Business Officer of Euroclear, and they will be having a conversation on building a European savings and investment union. So thank you, and we'll see you soon.